Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Daily Friend Wrap with me, Makone. I will be holding down the fort while Nicholas is away recovering, I believe, from a flu. He will be back next week, but so long, wish him some of those well wishes and get well soon wishes in the comments. I am joined by Marius Roodt, and we will be taking you through some of the stories and headlines coming from the media today, starting with the issue of Johannesburg's mayor. So we know that our previous mayor, Gwamanda of the Al Jamaa party, has handed in his resignation. I believe he did that yesterday. You'll remember that he was the compromise between the ANC and EFF, as they both wanted the position, but decided to elect a small party to hold the position instead. And we know that Morero is being tipped off to become the new mayor of Johannesburg. The article reads that Johannesburg Finance MMC Dada Morero has been nominated as mayor by the Gauteng ANC, the leading coalition, the Government of Local Unity, which includes the ANC, the EFF, the Patriotic Alliance, and minority parties, have 145 councillors. However, they need about 270 members to reach majority. You will also recall that Action SA promised the ANC about 44 of its councillors' votes should Gwamanda step down, which he has since done. And you also have another piece in the media talking about an emergency caucus meeting held in the very, very wee hours of the morning today between DA leaders to decide whether they'll be backing the ANC candidate or fielding their own. Marius, how are we supposed to be processing this? Do you think that this is a sign of the strength of the GNU, the fact that the DA are considering backing an ANC candidate? Or is the DA stronger for considering, having one of its own candidates be fronted instead?
Well, I think it all depends on what happens with Action SA and the ANC. Together, Action SA and the ANC have 135 seats in the Joburg City Council, which is 270. So the ANC and Action SA together have exactly 50%. So Action SA and the ANC plus another other party, maybe the IFP or something, would have a fairly stable coalition in that city. So I think what it does show you, though, is how our politics has changed quite significantly since May, with the Action SA before the election saying they would never work with the ANC. It'd be like basically making a deal with the devil and what have you. And now they decide they might work with the ANC, which I actually, things change in politics. I don't think we should really hold it against Action SA too much for changing their minds on this. The DA has also changed their mind on working with the ANC, obviously. And I think this is just reflection, as I say, of how politics has changed. And I think it's good that the dynamics of the GNU aren't necessarily affecting what's happening at local government level. It's just because we have a GNU at the moment between the DA and the ANC and IFP and other parties doesn't mean this has to happen in every other single municipality or province or whatever the case is. I've said on the show before, for example, in Tshwane, it wouldn't make sense, I don't think, for the DA to change its current governing coalition and go into an alliance with the ANC there, because the DA does seem to be doing some good work there. But if it makes sense in other places, then go for it. But see, in Joburg, it would make more sense, I think, for the DA to remain in opposition and let the ANC and Action SA and maybe one or two other parties see what they can do to try to sort out the city. But I think it's about time we got rid of Kabela Gwamanda. And his election in the first place just showed the absolute contempt that the ANC and EFF held for the residents of Johannesburg.
You could also argue for each other, because to not be able to negotiate leadership for one or the other and to elect somebody like just a complete outsider, but also somebody that has quite honestly not earned their spot. Al Jamaa barely scraped the barrel of the votes, and yet that for the ANC and the EFF seemed like the most easy compromise to arrive to. Does speak a lot about what's going on between those two parties there. Alas, we will move on to less, I would say, exciting news. The unemployment rates were released yesterday by Stats SA. and they revealed that the country's official unemployment rate has increased from 32% in the first quarter to 33.5% in the second, so about a 1% less, slightly less percentage point increase. And you've got comments from all three big parties, the ANC, the DA, and the EFF, weighing in on those levels, the rising levels of unemployment. The ANCYL said that this not only reflected a deepening crisis facing the country, but particularly its young people who were disproportionately affected by joblessness and economic exclusion. And to that, the EFF added that the second quarter is a revelation of the grim reality facing South Africa's working class. And then you have John Steenhuisen also saying that that rising unemployment is not only a crisis but a shame, and then outlining some of the ideas the GNU have for tackling the unemployment rate over their term. I also had a look at the youth survey that was released by Stats SA last week, I believe, profiling youth employment and some of the other youth socioeconomic indicators in the country. And there really seems to be a big problem there, Marius, because one of the things I was specifically looking for is the youth labor absorption rates. And they seem to be lower than they were in 2004, almost 20 years ago now. And equally, the youth labor participation rates were also on the decline. So you have an all-round issue of unemployment, but specifically one that is facing our youth and gripping the youth. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think also what we must talk about, apart from youth unemployment, is the expanded unemployment rate, which includes people who aren't looking for work, but they would work if they were offered a job. And if you look at those numbers, they're even more scary than the official numbers. I mean, Northwest Province, more than 54% of people are unemployed on the expanded definition. In the Eastern Cape, it's nearly 50%, and it's over 40% in every single province except for Gauteng and the Western Cape. And in Gauteng, on the expanded unemployment rate, it's 39.2, so basically 40%. And even the Western Cape, the expanded unemployment rate is 27%, which is still much better than the rest of the country, but it's far too high. And I've said on the show before, behind each of these numbers and proportions and so on, there's a real person who now has the indignity of not being able to work, not being able to provide for themselves and their family, being worried about, wondering where the next meal is going to come from. And I think this has to be an absolute laser focus of the GNU, is about getting people back into employment. And yeah, even, I mean, when it comes to youth unemployment, that's also something we have to concentrate on. But I think if we have to look at the issue holistically, and we just have to think about how we can get people working. And part of that is just getting the economy growing. I think that has got to be the absolute, basically the only focus of the GNU. The GNU is not going to work if things don't improve over the next 3 or 4 or 5 years for South Africans. And obviously the most, this is, as I say, this is kind of the cold face for people, and it's just the complete, distraction of human capital and human potential of not being able to work. And we know there's also an issue of long-term unemployment in South Africa. And the longer you are unemployed, the much harder it becomes to be employed again at some point. And if you look at things such as long-term unemployment, that's also pretty scary. There's so many people who've been unemployed for more than a year, whatever the case is. So this is actually the only thing the GNU should really be focusing on, is how to get the economy growing and how to get people into work.
Very important there, highlighting the extended definition. I think often this official unemployment rate tends to gloss over the real issues and really create and give us a false sense of security, even though we realize, the alarming rate of unemployment, especially when you compare against the
False
rest
sense of security is a bit of a loose term there, Makone.
Well, I guess because you don't actually get to see the real numbers, right, on the extended definition. And it's like, oh, these people are in despair and they've stopped looking. Let's just ignore them entirely. That's what the official rate does. It just continues to exclude those people who are already excluded, but not because they want to, but because nothing is letting up, right? And like you point out, the longer you are unemployed, the harder it becomes for you to, again, join the labor force. Yeah, issues that we hope the GNU government will be able to address speedily and effectively.
Mm.
On our last article for today, it's one that I actually authored. It's titled Time to Put an End to Apartheid's Founding Racial Categories. Marius, you and I have been working on this, and it's a challenge to South Africa's, particularly state institutions, to stop reinforcing and stop carrying out the apartheid founding racial classification rules and regulations. And one way in which we've done that, and we highlight in the article, is by writing to the South African Human Rights Commission, which seems to be everywhere except in their emails where they need to be responding to our questions to them about defining these racial categories, because you will be hard pressed to find laws in South Africa that actually do. So we asked them, what does it mean to be a Black person? What does it mean to be a colored person? Because those definitions that so many of our laws and acts of parliaments are predicated on can only be found in apartheid statutes like the Population Registration Act and the Group Areas Act, which were repealed in 1991, so long before the dawn of democracy even. And yet so many of our laws again continue to rely on those definitions. They get to like sort of go off into the sunset without ever being held accountable and having their feet held to the fire about what they mean when they define people by their racial categories or when they enforce racial categories and racial classifications. So yeah, we wrote to the SAHRC to no to no luck. They haven't yet responded to our mails. We've put out press releases to try to get their attention again, with no luck. And we're not the only ones. Parliament has actually commissioned the HRC to adjudicate over the matter with respect to a Glenn Snyman case. Glenn Snyman is actually a founder of this movement called People Against Racial Classification, and he was accused of fraud for, instead of ticking the colored box, he ticked the African box on the list of races on a job application and got into hot water. And I think when you look back at apartheid, people that did that, race classification detractors, a famous one that I can think of is Ernest Cole, apartheid photojournalist who was exiled, declassified himself from Black to colored so that he can gain access to spaces that were previously withheld from so-called Black people. During apartheid, it would get you lauded and piled on with praise, for defying the system and defying the oppressiveness of the system. Today, it got you, Marius, labeled as some sort of a defender of white supremacy. Care to speak a little bit more about your efforts challenging these racial classifications and some of the pushback, let's say, you've received?
So I also wrote a press release a little while ago on this, and then Gillian Skitter, who's a columnist for IRL, said it was quite naive and so on to want to do away with racial classifications, and it's actually as protecting white privilege and white supremacy and all this kind of stuff. This is also, Gillian Skitter was also producing a movie where a black man died. So, I mean, I don't want to accuse of anything, but it tells you a bit about, who's actually worried about people in general, I think. But yeah, it's I think it's just one of these things. As I say, if we're talking about things like African and what have you, Glenn Snyman is, as you said, he's a colored person, and most probably he's descended from, at least partly from, Khoisan people, who were literally the first people that settled in South Africa. So it's actually ridiculous to tell somebody like that they can't call themselves an African. But we also need to perhaps we start, if we want to keep racial categories, maybe we should start changing things. We can call people Black African, but then we also have to talk about colored Africans, white Africans, and Indian Africans. Maybe that's way of looking at it. Or I mean, I think this is all quite an important debate because of the history of the country. Sometimes we do need to look at how people of different population or racial groups are doing, and to see what advances we've made. But it also just keeps the importance of these race groups in people's minds, because we still insist on classifying people by race. That by itself makes race and racial classification still salient in South Africa, and we have to ask: is it still important to have them? I mean, there's nobody's saying that somebody can't identify if being a black person is very important to you. Nobody's saying you can't be proud of being black or whatever the case is, but it shouldn't be something that the government says you are a black person or you are a colored person or you are a white person, because there's no official definition on the statute books of what makes a black person or a white person. And if we want to go back to that, we'd actually have to go back to things like the pencil test and saying a white person is X. They have this kind of hair and this kind of complexion and blah, blah, blah. And we have to decide, do we want to go back to that kind of stuff? And there was, I mean, of course, apartheid had many horrors, but one of the worst things about it was that it reduced people to being a member of a group, not being an individual. You're a black person or white person or colored person before you were an individual. And obviously, if you were black or colored, then that restricted you with all kinds of opportunities and how your life would go and so on. So yeah, it's something that we really have to think about as a country, and it's definitely something that the Institute of Race Relations will be pushing to ask why we still have these classifications if there's no legal definitions for them anymore.
Very important to point out, Marius. And I agree with you that self-identification is one thing, and we can't take that away from people. Neither should we. It's the right to self-expression. But for the government to enforce and reinforce these classifications that were a cornerstone of apartheid, to classify people as black so that you can demean them and degrade them, so that you can create these caricatures and these boogeyman out of these categories, right? So that you can infer superiority or inferiority into those categories and use them to divide people. I think that does contribute to today's racial consciousness, which I don't think is a good thing. And we speak in the article about how words create worlds, right? And this obsession with race is definitely carried and transported or exists and is permeated certainly through the government reinforcing those very bigoted racial classifications. So hopefully this video gets the attention of the SAHRC and they can give us a response. Thank you for joining us. We hope to see you back here tomorrow. It'll probably be a different host. As I said again, Nicholas is away. He's indisposed, but we do wish him well. Thank you. And that is indeed a wrap.
The Daily Friend Show and The Daily Friend are a project of the Institute of Race Relations, the IRR. The IRR is a think tank which was founded in 1929 to study race relations in South Africa and works to change government policy to improve race relations through non-racialism and to ensure the prosperity of all South Africans. If you like our work and would like to support us, please go to irr.org.za and click Support the IRR. Or you can go to thedailyfriend.co.za and click the Fund Us button.